This is segment 1 of the first module of Select Topics in Social Epidemiology. And what we'll do here in the next 15 or so slides is basically go over what is social epidemiology so that we're more or less all on the same page. And specifically, we'll talk a little bit about social epidemiology as a subdiscipline within the wider discipline of epidemiology, and talk about some of the historical antecedents of and background for what preceded and gave rise to this subdiscipline of epidemiology. And first, for those of you who are not epidemiologists, we can define the broader discipline as the study of the distribution and causes of disease in populations. And the accented words here are significant because first, they convey the descriptive nature of the enterprise of epidemiology being focused on the distributions of diseases across groups and not necessarily at the individual level. And also the ideologic focus of epidemiology, really trying to understand what are the causes of disease outcomes in populations. So again, focusing on population level outcomes as compared to medicine, more focused at outcomes at the individual level. When we go on to define social epidemiology, more specifically, we have a couple of definitions from the literature. The first, courtesy of Berkman and Kawachi, defines social epidemiology as the branch of epidemiology that studies the social distribution and social determinants of health. Krieger goes on to emphasize some more specific characteristics of social epidemiology, claiming that it's distinguished by its insistence on explicitly investigating social determinants of population distributions of health, disease, and well-being, rather than treating such determinants as mere background to biomedical phenomena. And the significance of what she's emphasizing there will hopefully become more apparent over the next several slides, but just to foreshadow that a bit, what she's doing is focusing on the extent to which social epidemiology, in contrast to other forms of epidemiology, is really trying to foreground social factors that in traditional epidemiology have often been relegated to nuisance or control variables, potential confounders that need to be controlled for or restricted on or otherwise gotten out of the way of the true focus of study, which is something more proximate and biomedical. And so here with social epidemiology, the idea being that instead of trying to get these things, these social things that are often considered to be immutable, out of the way so we can really study what we want to study, here the discipline is saying, no, these themselves are what is the focus and the true interest of studying from an ideologic perspective. Some examples of the kinds of questions that animate the discipline of social epidemiology. Why is the life expectancy of black men in Harlem lower than that of men in Bangladesh, one of the poorest countries in the world? Why is the health of the better off, meaning socioeconomically better off, in the U.S. worse than the health of those who are less well off socioeconomically in the U.K.? So, study about place effects, really. Is the health of poor places bad because poor people live there, or is the health of poor places bad because there's something that is toxic about poor places? Why are there social disparities in health above a level of absolute resource deprivation? Why do gaps in health between the rich and the poor get worse over time and with or in the context of, despite, overall aggregate population level health improvements? And finally, if poverty is bad for health, why does physical population health appear to improve on several indicators in times of macroeconomic downturn? Things that happen under the rubric of social epidemiology are often called several different things, and one of the sub-foci of the discipline, of course, is trying to understand social disparities in health. Health things are often referred to as health inequalities, or more broadly as social determinants of health. And what I think is worth highlighting here is that Much of what happens in social epidemiology reflects an interest in social justice issues, in addition to, or as well as, interest in social causation. So many investigations under social epidemiology are motivated by a concern for social inequalities and social justice issues. However, many investigations that are part of the discipline are not necessarily motivated by those concerns and are rather simply trying to understand how social factors are ideologically important in trying to understand population health patterns, often because of findings that determinants at the individual level don't seem to fully explain health patterns that we observe. Another question I think is useful to ask, and it's not one I really hope to answer right now, but maybe one we can answer collectively over the course of the month, is what is it good for? Don't we already know, for example, that poverty, racism, etc. are bad? Why do we need to study how they impact health in order to determine if something should be done about them? A related question, how practical is it to intervene so far upstream when we focus on social factors? And is it the business of public health to try to influence non-public health policies? In other words, what goes on outside of the public health sector as it's kind of traditionally defined, and how can public health professionals try to have an impact in other sectors? And so, like I said, I don't really want to give you my answers to these questions. I have answers to these questions that I'm satisfied with, but I think it would be more enriching to try to answer this collectively as we go through this material. But I just want to acknowledge these questions up front. Okay, trying to understand some of the historical antecedents of social epidemiology, I will locate it in historical trends in epi more broadly in very crude fashion, basically dividing the entire history of epidemiology into two eras, which is comical, but I think it serves our purpose. The first being a focus on infectious diseases in an era in countries such as the US where infectious diseases were the primary paramount concern for population health. And at that time, the approach used to investigate infectious diseases actually made quite rich attempts at theorizing about what was going on to produce bad health outcomes. But given the limitations at the time, biologically, statistically, the tools at hand were rather limited. And the outcome of this focus and the approach used were often very elaborated theories about miasma, contagion, germ theory, and so forth, that were often, until substantiated empirically, only really useful and applied at a very theoretical level because the tools did not exist to substantiate a lot of the theorizing that was being done. So to contrast that with the subsequent era focused much more on chronic disease outcomes, this can be sort of the modern epidemiologic era in the 20th century, especially the late 20th century, really focusing on chronic non-communicable diseases. There you see the development of better tools, not just biological tools to understand biologic, etiologic agents, but also just statistical tools. And there you kind of see, in comparison to this earlier era, a relative abandonment of theory. And what came out of this era has often been referred to in literature as risk factor epidemiology or black box epidemiology, where we have a lot of different possible etiologic agents that go into the mix. We often put them all in, put them in a regression model, see what turns out to remain statistically significant, and then identify these things as the relative risk factors of importance. The black box epidemiology, that phrase refers to the fact that in an absence of theory, comparatively speaking, you're looking at statistical associations without an elaborated understanding or theory about what the mechanisms of action are. You're just observing this association and determining whether or not it's statistically robust, and then deciding, well, we don't really know why this is a factor in health, but it seems to be replicated and important in in producing an elevated relative risk of some kind of outcome. And critics of this era of epidemiology, this modern era of epidemiology, have been part of what preceded, I think, the development of social epidemiology in its modern incarnation as a self-conscious discipline. So we can describe this modern epidemiology, again, focusing on multiple risk factors as part of an overall web of causation. Nancy Krieger, in an article in your recommended list, talks about the web of causation in the absence of a spider or the agent driving the patterns observed and the risk factors that are part of this web of causation. Again, this part of the black box, lack of theory on as to why these things matter and what the hypothesized mechanisms are, but kind of throwing everything with the kitchen sink into stepwise regression models and seeing what sticks. Again, this is an era focused on chronic diseases, and as a result, a lot of attention to individual health behaviors, and which is part of the individual level focus of this type of epidemiology overall. And this era of epidemiology has been critiqued as a result of these things for its biomedical individualism, or individualism focused on individual level health behaviors. And McMichael, in his paper in the recommended list, goes on to talk about the proximate constraints operating for this type of epidemiology, with too much emphasis on individual risk factors versus population patterns, the more proximate to the outcome determinants versus those that are more distal or upstream, and to a focus on more static life stages for the timing of exposure, rather than thinking about over the life course how exposures at different periods over the life course might matter, how the chronicity of those exposures or the acuteness of the timing of those exposures might matter. And he also critiques epidemiology for its focus on the past or present, lacking a kind of predictability to forecast future trends and outcomes. And the latter is something that I don't believe social epidemiology has really improved upon, but it could start to do so more with the use of simulation approaches that other aspects of epidemiology have used as well. So that reading is also part of your recommended list. And social epidemiology, again, in its modern incarnation as a self-conscious subdiscipline of epidemiology, really is responding to a lot of the aspects of this era that preceded it in a number of ways. One, by insisting on the relevance of context and ideology in the production of science itself through an array of factors related to social, political, and economic dimensions. So critical social theory, the importance of making theory and explicit assumptions in epidemiologic research. For those of you who have backgrounds in humanities or social science, this isn't really startling, but or a radical idea. But in epidemiology, coming out more out of the biomedical traditions, the idea of understanding science and the production of science as a social phenomenon, the insistence on using theoretical approaches that then make explicit the underlying assumptions that are going into the production of research. These things were rather alien, I think, in traditional modern epidemiology, and something that social epi brought back in. And last, I think really specific to what was going on in public health at the time, back in sort of the 80s, is really challenging implicit normative attitudes about lifestyles and personal responsibility, highlighting the role of social context. So given that modern epidemiology had this very individual level focus, biomedical or very health behavior oriented, in general, admonishing people to take personal responsibility for their lives and lifestyles, and but of course the other thing that was going on at this time in the US and elsewhere in the 80s especially was with the rise of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and therefore in public health, a real acute focus on lifestyles, as the term implies, something that's very much function of individual level choices, and people's so-called bad habits and bad choices around their health. And I think the social epidemiology was one of many arenas that really pushed back on the implicit normative attitudes that were reflected in these types of approaches to public health at the time. Social epidemiology is often referred to as a marriage between this guy, this is representing sociology, this is Emil Durkheim, and of course John Snow, a marriage of sociology and epidemiology. We can make room for a lot of other disciplines, but the key idea here being that it's interdisciplinary and really an attempt to marry the theory from the social sciences with the understandings of social phenomena more broadly. That's not just the purview of sociology, with the use of epidemiologic methods to really understand social causation and how social factors are causally related to health outcomes. This is what you get when you let a 5-year-old help you make slides when he's home from school sick. The pictures here are trying to capture some of what I've been describing is this kind of individual level biomedical, individual health-oriented behaviors, kinds of dominant focus in epidemiology that social epi was responding to and rejecting. And what you have in this modern era of social epidemiology then initially was simply a documentation of understanding the associations between social factors like income and mortality, and also looking at racial patterns in health outcomes, and a really important period of just documenting descriptively really significant racial disparities in health outcomes. And then also applying theory to try to figure out what is going on, why do these associations exist, what are the mechanisms that link social factors, the X, to health outcomes, the Y. And then a lot of attention also in the first modern era, decade, I think, of social epidemiology on how we take these big, fat, complex social constructs that are of interest and make them usable, operationable in population health studies, so that you can actually incorporate them into surveys as measurable constructs and then use them to statistically understand their association with health outcomes. And you see over time this really dramatic rise in, this doesn't even go past up to the last decade, but here you see after 1980 a real explosion in literature referred to with social epidemiology in the title abstract or keywords. In the second decade or so, we'll just say from like the mid-90s on, you really see another kind of proliferation in social epidemiology. A full-on textbook in the year 2000, the second edition is now underway. More attention to how social factors really get under the skin. How do social phenomena outside the body actually affect physiological processes underneath the skin and therefore manifest as pathological health outcomes? Again, really trying to get at and reintegrate an understanding of biology with attention to social factors. Also, you see during this kind of second era, or latter era of social epidemiology, much more attention to trying to figure out how we can make more rigorous causal inferences by really understanding what the threats to the inferences around causation are, and how we can make better use of statistical and study design tools to try to identify and isolate causal factors. And also an engagement with policy. So what are the implications of this that have been observed, our understandings of social factors that are relevant for health, and how they can be translated into programmatic and policy approaches. And of course, you know, a discipline has matured when it has the wherewithal to engage in a fair bit of navel gazing, and of course that is definitely the case with social epidemiology. That's the end of the first segment, and I'll see you soon in the next.